Dr. Ormsby. Our next speaker is well-versed in many aspects of conservation science, from bumblebee movement patterns to the hazards of climate change. Dr. Adam Whelchel has crossed disciplinary and geographic boundaries in his work to advance conservation efforts that recognize ecological and humanitarian needs. Currently, Dr. Whelchel is the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy of Connecticut, where he translates his scientific expertise into practical applications for restoring and protecting ecosystems. Prior to this, he served in other leadership positions at the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut, serving as Director of Conservation Science and then Director of Conservation Programs. Dr. Whelchel earned his PhD in plant and soil science at the University of Delaware in 2006 and has expertise in the field of wetland ecology. In 2009, Dr. Whelchel received a Coda Global Fellowship, which took him to Kenya to work alongside Wangari Maathai, founder of the Green Belt Movement and the first environmentalist to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Here too, Dr. Whelchel's work advanced both ecological and humanitarian needs, as his input helped to direct the movement's efforts to sites that would maximize the opportunities for forest restoration, poverty alleviation, and community empowerment. Today, Dr. Whelchel will share his insights on the vital links between communities and conservation in Africa, connections that are crucial to the future of biodiversity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adam Whelchel.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I've been at BAT several times, planning for a few of these in the past, and I'm very excited. This is a chance for me to get up here and tell you a little bit about what I know. Okay, this morning at breakfast, I was having a conversation with my children about the wonderful opportunity that today holds, and the first thing they said was, okay, what are you gonna be doing in Africa this time? And I looked at them and I said, well, you see, they've become accustomed to this quest that we're all on here today, this voice that tells us that there is a better way. We just need to find it. It got me thinking, though, what exactly, that age-old question of what exactly is Africa? And, you know, I am far from being able to answer that question here today, but I can tell you it has something to do with big words like sustainability, equitability, and conservation. But more directly, it has to do with that inextricable link between people and nature. And I'll be focusing on that inextricable link here today. We're talking about challenges and opportunities, and talking about a few key, carefully chosen projects that will serve as to demonstrate that link or bridge between people and nature in Africa. One thing's for sure, Africa is a huge place in many respects. It represents 20% of the Earth's landmass, and it encompasses easily China, India, Europe, United States. It is a huge place. It also represents 15% of the world's population and has added 700 million people in the last 60 years. Estimates suggest that by 2050, 1 in 3 children on this planet will be born in sub-Saharan Africa. It is a place full of challenges and opportunities. Yes, it is blessed. Africa has a lot of wild lands and waters, which are home to an incredible number and diversity of species, often living in close proximity to people, and shared resources such as water, grasslands, and forests. There's also a great diversity of peoples with different traditions and cultures. Probably right now, today, during the course of this conference, there have been between 1,000 to 2,000 languages spoken on the continent. But for most of rural Africa, the connections to the land take on unique meaning because their daily existence depends on the productivity of those natural resources. The challenges come in many forms in Africa, which are very familiar. We've touched on a lot of these over the last couple of days. They're typically tied to this imbalance between need and availability today and tomorrow. They include limited access to critical things such as clean water, food, and pasture lands. This imbalance often leads to a degradation of the environment or conflicts. Some of the key conflicts include the exploitation of public lands or waters for private gain, and familiar things such as overgrazing and deforestation. Africa has some of the highest deforestation rates on the planet, with recent estimates about 4 million hectares per year. Very significant deforestation, even on the par with the Amazon basin. And of course, climatic change and the implications of extending and more pronounced droughts, but more importantly, the desynchronizing or the variation in precipitation patterns that much of rural Africa depends on. So given this backdrop, our quest naturally leads to a clear and fundamental question. Where are those bridges between the imbalance and the more sustainable path to conservation? Well, let's take a look at a couple stories, a couple examples that I hope will help to answer that question a little bit here this afternoon. I work for the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest conservation organization. We operate domestically in all 50 states and close to or over 30 countries at this point. I need to mention that our intellectual origin and much of the work that I'll be talking about today owes itself to folks like Dick Goodwin, who has obviously is very much a part of this this center here. Back in 2006, we initiated our Africa program. Now, we recognize that a lot of people, a lot of NGOs had been doing a lot of work in Africa for a long time. So we were strategically identified gaps and additive opportunities. Our core operating principles include first, to work in partnership with local and place-based conservation organizations. Secondly, to connect the conservation work and outcomes with human well-being. And third, to transfer technical tools, skills, and resources to those that have interest. One of our focal countries for the Africa program is Kenya. Now, Kenya sits within a collection of other very important countries in East Africa. To the north, you have Ethiopia and Somalia. To the south, you have Tanzania. To the west, you have Uganda, with key places that you've heard of, Lake Victoria or the Serengeti. Highlighted in dark green here are the current forest reserves in the country of Africa, which will become an important part of the story I'll be telling today. Two projects I'd like to tell you about. The first will be the Upper Tana Water Fund, and the second will be the Northern Rangeland Trust. Back in 2008, we began a conversation with a few place-based conservation organizations in Kenya, including the Greenbelt Movement. At the time, there was a national interest in restoring forest cover to 10%, principally in the what are called the 5 water towers in the country of Kenya, going from east to west: Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, the Mau Forest Complex, the Chirigani Hills, and Mount Elgon. Over the last half century or so, the forest cover in Kenya has declined from 20% down to just over 2%, including indigenous forests as well as plantations, or roughly about 1.4 million hectares. So over the course of 3 years, I had the opportunity of being embedded with the Greenbelt Movement alongside the late Professor Wangari Maathai. And my role was principally to help them be more strategic from an ecological perspective with their tree planting and community empowerment efforts. Now, right off the bat, I noticed that there was a bit of disconnect between the work they were doing and the goals that they had set for themselves and for the forests of Kenya. And as I sat there with the professor one afternoon, going over this exact slide, the skies began to open for the Greenbelt movement. If we take this lofty goal of 10% forest cover, I said, in English, and we subtract out the current forest cover of 1.4 million hectares, our goal becomes 4.4 million hectares. Now we know that we plant about 1,000 trees per hectare. That equals about the need for 4.4 billion trees. Now that doesn't account for the further degradation or harvest for charcoal or timber export from the existing cover. So we have a rough estimate of 4.4 billion trees. So I, back of the envelope, did some quick calculations, and I said, did you realize that that will take you 2,201 years to achieve? The professor turned to me and simply said, this is unacceptable. There has to be a better way. This began our journey with watershed management. The concepts of watershed management may seem rudimentary for us, but in a lot of cases it's novel in the continent of Africa. The idea of thinking about ecological boundaries versus geopolitical boundaries. The concept that different parts of a watershed provide different services. From the headwaters, where the filtration and storage and biodiversity is supported, to the transition zone, or the middle part of a watershed, where you typically have your crops and your livelihood, irrigation, power generation, and the deposition, or the bottom of the watershed, where you typically have your urban development and consumption. Now, the other concept that they found important was that there's a dependence and a connection between what you do in a watershed. What you do in the upper watershed and the middle watershed has direct bearing on the downstream communities. They saw a lot of value in this, and partners have as well in Kenya. What they like best about the watershed approach is that it can build a sense of community. It's not one community at a time based on geopolitical boundaries. It's a watershed with all communities connected. Helps to reduce conflict and increase commitment to actions that improve livelihood and biodiversity. So through the course of many workshops and many discussions, we arrived at a focal point for a watershed management approach. And this, of course, is the Upper Tana River watershed that originates in the Aberdares and Mount Kenya water towers that I just showed a moment ago. Yes, water towers, watershed. That was a huge discussion point, but I won't go into that now. The Tana River feeds, this Upper Tana watershed feeds about 700 kilometers in length, the Tana River, which flows out into the delta in the Indian Ocean. It is a critical river for Kenya. It provides 90% of the water, fresh water, for Nairobi. And Nairobi is the economic hub of East Africa, serving 350 million people. There are 5 dams on the Upper Tana that provide 70% of Kenya's electricity. And unfortunately, the per capita water availability has declined by 75% in the last 40 years. Bottom line, a great deal of dependence and urgency for millions of thirsty people on the Upper Tana watershed. Now, these characteristics identified the Upper Tana watershed as a perfect candidate to leverage about a decade's worth of work by the Nature Conservancy and many other partners in Latin America on water funds. You can see here in blue are the water funds that are either mature. This started back in Quito, Ecuador in 2003 and has been leveraged and expanded to all of the other blue dots that you can see up here. The empty dots represent that 5-year vision. It has been so successful that it's being leveraged and exported around Latin America with the idea of 32 water funds serving 50 million people and conserving about 7 million acres of lands in those watersheds. So we asked ourselves, is this a better way for the Upper Tana River watershed? And this idea of establishing the first water fund in Africa. And the answer was yes. And we have been busy over the last few years attempting to establish this first water fund in the Upper Tana River for Africa. So how do they work? Water funds are market-based mechanisms driven by watershed conservation activities that provide cost-effective improvements to both water quality and quantity. It's about conserving natural capital at the source in that upper headwater area. And again, the idea is to ensure good quality water, adequate quantity, lower costs of treatment and distribution, and yes, enhance the livelihoods of inhabitants, whether it's a local tribe or an elephant. And the idea here is that there's a valuable return on that investment for watershed protection. Now, every water fund has some similarities in terms of the structure and the mechanism, but how it plays out is often tailored for that specific location. Some of the key elements include having a funder. Typically, these are large users, water companies, power generation companies, and that's certainly the case here in the Upper Tana watershed. You also need to have a recipient, somebody that can take those funds and use that to create conservation on the ground in the upper watersheds. And of course, the Greenbelt movement is a perfect candidate for that particular activity. And yes, there is a governance structure in between there, the Water Fund Board, that enables that to happen and also monitors and documents the return on investment. So yes, you need big users, and in this case there are. The Nairobi water companies expend a great deal of money on treating water that is sediment-laden, wash load. They also do not have the ability to store enough water to provide to their customers. Water is available, those who have running water in Nairobi is available twice a week. Imagine the conflicts in the black market that emerges if you can only get water twice a week. The Kenyan power generating companies lose in drought years about 14 million US, and they've severely underestimated the storage capacity and the sediment rates in these watersheds. Sedimentation is occurring at twice what they had anticipated during construction 20, 30 years ago. So again, you have a great deal of dependence and urgency by some large users, which form a necessary ingredient for a water fund. So, what are the benefits? What's keeping these large users their attention? Well, they see the possibility for reducing treatment costs and minimizing interruptions for their customers. They see more reliable, longer-term hydropower supply, and they see a positive return on investment through watershed health, biodiversity, increasing services. And ultimately, this is about conservation on the ground. 3 slides below, we've completed the technical feasibility study, we've completed the business feasibility study, and we are now going through a proof of concept on the ground using projects such as you can see here. On the left-hand side is an eroding slope that will be revegetated and returned to secondary forest to help stabilize that, more filtration, more storage, biodiversity. So it's an exciting story that I think demonstrates that bridge between people and nature. And these projects generate income that stay in the community, that are hired by folks like GBM, Greenbelt Movement, to actually do the work. So the second story I'd like to tell you about is situated in the northern rangelands of Kenya, to the north of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares. This story starts back in 1922 when the Craig and Douglas family immigrated to a place called Lewa Downs, which is a cattle ranch that they've been running for the last 50 years. Ian Craig is a third generation pictured here, Kenyan by birth, who was raised with a conservation ethic that requires a balance between livestock, the land, and wildlife. Unfortunately, in 1992, he witnessed a massacre, a slaughter of an elephant herd to the north of his ranch, where he was powerless to do anything about it. This event solidified what has become a vocation. This idea that wildlife has no future unless local communities participate in its protection. Now, he reached that same spot that the professor did. He reached that spot where he said, there has to be a better way. Herein lies the origin of the Northern Rangeland Trust. Back in 1995, Ian Craig converted his Lewa Downs Ranch into a nonprofit, the Lewa Wildlife Conservancy. And this has really led the way and served as an anchor for the generation and evolution of the Northern Rangeland Trust. This 62,000-acre conservancy, which sits there indicated in purple, sits right in the core just north of Aberdares and Mount Kenya. These arrows indicate elephant migration routes or movement routes of not only elephants but also other wildlife. So it was based on this premise that let's provide movement corridors for wildlife. So over the years, you will see that each of these blocks represents an independent conservancy, either run and operated by a single tribe, or in some cases, multiple tribes, Samburu, Maasai, Tana, different tribes that in some cases have to work together. As you can see over the years, the number of conservancies has grown. And as a conservation biologist, we love to see large pieces of contiguous habitat connected by corridors. I'm sure you've heard that before. So here we are. We start with 62,000 acres. Over a 17-year period, the number of conservancies and land under management within the Northern Rangeland Trust has increased to 5 million acres across 19 conservancies. Currently, there are 23 conservancies pending application and enrollment in the Northern Rangeland Trust. It's starting to stretch up to Ethiopia. And we have a new cluster of conservancies in the lower Tana River Delta. Connections are being made. So what is the NRT, or Northern Rangeland Trust, and why is it so successful? Well, the mission is direct. It's to improve wildlife and conservancy communities through wildlife conservation. The core values are clear: wildlife, livestock, and people to coexist. Meaningful livelihoods benefits through and for wildlife, and a sense of equitable distribution of those benefits across these conservancies. The goals are direct as well. Enable conservation and community development, this intersection, this bridge, this inextricable link, all for one purpose: to sustain wildlife populations and movement. Now, with any key and good example, this truly is the beating heart. This is from which, the well from which all successes in the NRT flow. Good governance structure. The highest governing body at the NRT is the Council of Elders. Now, this is populated by the chief or the director of each and every conservancy. There's an equal voice here and a shared voice that results in a shared responsibility. The Council of Elders guides NRT policy, and they own the bylaws which dictate the administration and operation of the NRT. The board director of NRT reports directly to the Council of Elders. And most importantly, and one of the most significant elements of the Council of Elders is the conflict resolution team. In many cases, the conflict resolution team has been asked by the Kenyan military to precede their rather heavy-handed command and control kind of approach to domestic violence, to cattle rustling, to banditry. The conflict resolution team, populated by the Council of Elders, goes in first and seeks resolution as part of the NRT. A very significant piece of success here that cannot be understated, and certainly is a leverageable component for other types of projects. So right at the core of this, of the NRT, is protection of wildlife, and it comes in 3 different programs: anti-poaching operations, wildlife monitoring, and rangeland management. The anti-poaching operations is pretty clearly focused on rhinos and elephants. NRT has trained, sometimes along with British officers who do operations in northern Kenya, has trained hundreds of rangers that team up with Kenyan Wildlife Service to run operations to intercede and prevent poaching activities. Now, the other element here is that there's a lot of social pressure that's brought to bear here. Poaching is not good for wildlife, which threatens the conservancy, which is part of the NRT. There's many examples where local people have brought forward the names of those bad actors, the local poachers, to the chief, and they have self-policed. Now, this is critically important because the courts in Kenya are particularly lenient on poaching, sometimes handing out small fines. A tusk from a large elephant can fetch upwards of $9,000 US, and that represents a significant sum when you're living on $100, $200 a year. The second program is the wildlife monitoring, and NRT has trained over 200 rangers across a 2 million acre expanse that track on a daily basis the relative abundance and distribution of wildlife using GPS. So this provides a huge database from which NRT can use as a metric to monitor their success. The third big one I wanted to spend a little bit of time on with you is rangeland management. Now, for the communities of northern Kenya, livestock represents a way of life and a means of survival in an exceedingly arid and hostile environment. However, the combination of inefficient markets, unpredictable weather, and in some cases traditional ways of grazing have resulted in overgrazing and loss of pasture. So NRT is really on the path to solve this issue through better rangeland management. The goal is really about improving soil conditions to ensure that there's good grass cover all year round for livestock and wildlife. There are 2 linked programs. One focuses on alternate grazing patterns, and the other is providing that marketplace to effectively reinforce those different ways of doing things. The planned grazing program, traditionally semi-nomadic pastoralists, Samburu, Maasai, tend to allow their cattle just to go where they will. What NRT has done with the first phase of the program was to take 200 head of cattle owned by 20 different families and get them to bunch up their cattle and move them around as one unit. Now, the idea here is that it helps to break up the hard pan and the encrusted soil surface and fertilize that soil. Now, the first phase was so successful that it's now been expanded to 500 head of cattle across 102 families. Now, why would they do that? Well, the return on investment is clear. Cattle within the planned grazing program fetches $330. Cattle outside of the planned graze program using traditional methods fetches $250. The message is clear to the herdsman in this case that better rangeland management translates into healthier, fatter cattle and a higher income. Now, the second piece is livestock markets. Now, NRT has created a competitive marketplace based on performance criteria across the conservancies. NRT will buy your cattle above local market rates as long as you're one of the best performing conservancies. In order to meet that category, you need to adhere to a couple different criteria. You need to have good governance. You need to demonstrate that you're improving wildlife habitat, and you need to demonstrate that you've been successful at providing and improving the livelihoods and incomes of those people that live within your conservancy. By mid-2012, over 1,800 pastoralists from 11 different conservancies have sold over 4,000 head of cattle to the NRT for a total value of $1.17 million US. Now, that is a staggering number if you consider the fact that this has been so readily accepted. And again, I think it owes itself, this success owes itself to the governance structure that I mentioned before, the Council of Elders. There's community-led, community-driven buy-in from the front end. So there are a lot of other things that they generate income from. Most of the conservancies, or I should say a pretty good percentage, have lodges where you can go and stay and have a meaningful safari aside from the Serengeti and the Masai Mara, the more traditional and well-worn tourist routes. In most cases, about 40% of the revenue generated from these lodges goes back into operations of that lodge. Anywhere from 70 to 90% of the people working in these lodges come from that conservancy. And the remaining 60% goes into things such as schools, education for boys and girls, health clinics, as well as water resources for irrigation, as well as for wildlife. Now, there's also a financing end to this, this idea of microcredits to encourage women's group to develop items for fair trade markets, et cetera. So the bottom line here is to try to shift the source of revenue away from livestock, to eliminate those conflicts and, again, support wildlife conservation in this part of the world. So I hope through those two stories I have demonstrated a little bit that it's not so much about we need to find a better way. The idea is that we have found a better way at large scales using different governance structure and mechanisms in these two examples. And I think this really does, in my mind, helps to provide that inextricable link, or that bridge between both people and nature. Now, there's one quote from one of the chiefs of the Conservancy that I'd like to read to you, because I think it really speaks volumes in this particular case, and potentially could serve as some inspiration for you on your quest as you seek examples like this in your part of the world. Now, when I see elephants grazing, I see an irrigation scheme. When I see lions in the grass, I see better security. And when I see a newborn rhino, I see classrooms for our children. That, to me, is the link, and that is the way forward. And I hope that you have seen some value in this presentation. If you would like to find out more, here are a couple links. There's a flyer on the table out front there, and feel free to contact me at any time. And if you want to go on a real safari, let me know. Thank you very much. Time for questions? Yes.
I was fortunate enough to go to see one of the watershed development projects in India, and it was a ring around two very disparate villages, and beyond the benefits that you mentioned, the fact that they were able to triple their crop production and sell what they didn't need to others, and then use those funds to fund their educational and social programs. And then the fact that the trees, of course, absorb over 420,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year is extraordinary. So I'm wondering, this seems to be such a positive approach to biodiversity. What would be the downside? What would be the reason people would use to argue against it?
I think I heard, what would be the downside to this kind of approach from a biodiversity conservation type of perspective? Not enough of it, not quick enough. But, I'm showing you I'm skimming some of the cream here to show you some of the real successes of these two programs. Any program like this has cost and sacrifice along with it. The downside, again, this is based on the premise that there is a better way. The risk is what I saw in terms of where people were deciding to do their tree planting. It wasn't, you know, there are too few of us and too little time from a conservation perspective that we have to do things smarter. So if you can plant a forest that provides a product that you can eat on a steep slope that prevents soil from going into a river, that's a win-win-win. This idea that not every hectare is created equal, right? You need to be strategic. There's too little time. And we need to be very focused and very strategic about where we do our work if we want to retain the kind of planet we have now in the future. I think it's almost Earth Day, so that was a little preamble, perhaps. That may not answer your question, but I'm happy to spend some time with you if you like. Thank you. Yes?
I'm puzzled by the economics of the Northern Rangeland Trust, in a good way.
Yeah.
But I don't understand how you can make $16,000 by killing an elephant, just carrying off its tusks.
Yep.
Anyone wouldn't do anything else. So what are the economic motivations that lead so many people to engage in alternative livelihoods?
That's a great question. So it's all predicated, and I'm not an economist, but I'll try here a little bit. So it's all predicated on the benefit to an individual is far inferior to the benefit of the community. The community benefits if they work together through the rangeland management process. That benefit is shared. You know, the idea of $10 for 100 households is much better than $10,000 for an individual. You know, so it's based on this, I guess the whole premise of this conference, this idea of fairness and justice and the equitable exchange. Right now, the NRT is funded principally through private donation, you know, developing this kind of thing. But the idea is that thinking about it in terms of thirds. So a third from private donation, a third ideally from the Kenyan Wildlife Service or the Kenyan Forest Service, putting money into improving wildlife that has a direct benefit to the country, and then a third being generated by the communities themselves for themselves.
So the short answer is that most of the people would effectively be excluded from the poaching anyway because it's captured by the armed.
It's one individual. It's one individual or several individuals, often from outside the community. So, you know, my option as a community member is nothing from that transaction and nothing because we've lost the elephants. Okay. And I think that's really the trick here is how do we incentivize this kind of change? And I think what I tried to demonstrate here were two market-driven strategies that are designed to exactly do that. So it's breaking that link and smashing the status quo by changing the marketplace, if you will, so that more people benefit versus the few. Yeah. Glenn?
Anybody who's against these?
Yeah, sure. Everybody's against it until it works, and it's starting to work. So, yeah, just one quick example. I mentioned the grazing program and this idea of it's the traditional way of doing things is to allow the cattle to go everywhere, and that was a major hurdle. This idea that who I am as a man depends on the size of my herd, right? If you start taking away my herd, I am half a man. That doesn't equate well with you know, the social structure and where you fit in. But if you have, you know, this idea of changing that, it's not the size of your herd, it's the size of your wallet. And the idea that if you can bank that profit and then buy back in when the head of cattle are cheaper, I will have over time, it's sort of that investment mentality. Now, obviously, there are some risks to that. And that's why I was trying to stress this community-led, community-driven approach. You know, this outside influence coming in and introducing, you know, influences that are natural to us, but could be a serious detriment to the culture and the traditions that have been going on in the landscape for thousands and thousands of years. So again, it's all the art of presenting and allowing the community to find their way, given tools and skills of that nature. So, thank you very much.